Good morning. I want to ask you a question before I get into the passage. I want you to try and imagine if this has ever been a situation you've been in. Have you ever been part of a really large crowd of people but felt like you're invisible or felt like you're unnoticed? And how did that feel? I'm going to give you an example. When I was 19, I decided to run the London Marathon. And against all the odds, got in on the ballot, then had to do it, obviously. And if you've ever done a big running event, you'll know, especially one that big, you'll know that you basically get put into like a pen at the start with loads of other people that are likely to run at a similar pace to you. And you just wait for ages, especially with the London Marathon, because there's like 50,000 people trying to run at the same time. And you're surrounded by people, but nobody really looks at each other because everyone's quite nervous and a bit sort of worried, I guess, about the challenge they've set themselves or maybe thinking about the time they're going to run. And you just sort of stand and you wait. And then eventually you go. You never hear the start because you're miles away, but you eventually go. And then you run as a huge crowd. And it's amazing. It is an absolutely amazing experience. But you're on your own in amongst loads of people. And when I did it, it was brilliant. I saw all the sights. But at certain points, miraculously, my family appeared. And they somehow managed to see me 4 separate times, which is a miracle, really, because I had no way of them tracking me. And it's London on the day of the London Marathon. But they saw me. And it was the most amazing feeling to hear my name called from the side of the road at different points, especially when I got a bit later on and seemed to have forgotten the ability to run and was really struggling. Actually, I was seen by people that I knew, and it was amazing. So I just want to leave you with that as we go into the passage. When I was given this passage today, to preach on today, I thought, this is great. I mean, obviously, I would think that about any passage, but actually, the main reason I thought it was great was because I thought I knew it pretty well. As it turns out, I know part of it, but as with lots of things and lots of parts of the Bible, there were lots of bits that I'd forgotten. It really is an extraordinary story, or a combination of 2 stories, really. It's challenged me and encouraged me so much as I've prepared to talk about it this week. So I hope I can convey at least a bit of that encouragement and challenge this morning. This is a story of 3 parts, much like a drama with 3 scenes. And the scenes here are certainly very dramatic, chaotic even. Jesus has just crossed back over the Sea of Galilee and comes ashore to be swamped by crowds of people, all vying for his attention and keen to hear what he has to say. And amongst the crowd are the 2 key characters of the story: Jairus, a synagogue leader, renowned and respected in the community, but very unlikely to have shown any outward interest in the teachings of Jesus because of his role in the synagogue. And the unnamed woman, an outcast, ignored and avoided by her community because of her poor health. First to enter the scene is Jairus, and in dramatic fashion. What does he do? He falls at Jesus' feet and pleads earnestly with him. His daughter is dying, and he pleads with Jesus to help him. I've read quite a lot this week about how controversial that act of pleading would have been for Jairus. As a synagogue leader, he would have cut a dignified figure in the community, upholding the Jewish faith and setting an example to others. Jesus was the controversial speaker who was drawing crowds wherever he went and upsetting the status quo. It was not considered appropriate for Jairus to show any interest in Jesus' teachings, let alone beg him for help in front of a large crowd. On the other side of this, though, Jairus was a dad, and he loved his daughter. And he, like any other parent, would do absolutely anything to give their dying child a chance of survival. So within the context of the time, it was shocking, but it was also a completely expected response to his daughter's condition. Jairus was bold in showing his faith. He had heard enough about Jesus to know that there was reason to hope. And Jesus sees Jairus, not as one of the synagogue leaders who opposes his teaching, but as someone who's approached him in faith and asked him for his help. So then comes scene 2. Jesus is on his way to Jairus' house with a large crowd pressed around him, when a woman in the crowd comes up behind him and touches his cloak. This woman has suffered terribly. Not only has she suffered from bleeding for 12 years, but as a result of her physical suffering, she's a social outcast. She has spent all of her money on doctors who, instead of making things better, have made them worse, and now she has nothing. I'd like to think that the stigma attached to this woman's condition was something that's not experienced anymore. We should be appalled by the way that she was treated by her community, but perhaps we should be more appalled that it still happens today. Women's health is still stigmatized around the world. Women are isolated from their communities, not allowed to enter certain buildings, treated as unclean, even made to keep away from others. There are plenty of women living now whose experiences would resonate with the woman in this story. But the woman in the story has heard about Jesus. So when her chance comes, she reaches out and touches his cloak, because she thought that just to touch his clothes might be enough to heal her. She couldn't have been bold like Jairus. She didn't have that option. The crowd would surely have driven her away from Jesus. So she was forced to demonstrate her faith in secret, in timidity and in silence. So she touched his cloak, and immediately she was healed. What an incredible feeling that must have been. I imagine she found it quite hard to take in. 12 years of pain, suffering, poverty, shame, and loneliness suddenly taken away. She had faith to know that Jesus could heal her, but it must still have been a pretty heart-stopping moment. And there follows a curious interaction between Jesus and his disciples, in which Jesus asks, "Who touched my clothes?" Jesus knows who touched his cloak, but he wants to have a public interaction with this woman and to show the crowd this person who's just been healed. The woman eventually reveals herself and falls at his feet, just as Jairus did. I'm sure the crowd would have recognized this woman. They would have known her by her health issues and would probably have gone out of their way to avoid her. Jesus would have known that according to the law, interacting with the woman would have rendered him unclean. But I think Jesus very deliberately wants to demonstrate that he'll happily break through social boundaries to heal and restore. And he frees this woman from her suffering. And not only that, but despite already knowing who's touched his cloak, it says in verse 32 that Jesus kept looking around to see who had touched him. Jesus wants the woman to know that he sees her, despite what society says. And Jesus sees us, regardless of our social standing, our health, how popular we are, how well known, how respected, how important, how prominent we are in our community. Jesus sees us. Anyone can come to Jesus. No one is beyond his compassion. When it comes to asking Jesus for help, there are no social boundaries. No one is an outcast. Everyone is welcome, and everyone is seen. So imagine now in the story that you're Jairus. You've begged Jesus to heal your daughter. Time couldn't be more pressing. And instead of ignoring this woman in the crowd, Jesus has stopped and spent time talking to her. And all the while, Jairus' daughter is rapidly deteriorating. In fact, while Jesus is still speaking to the woman, someone arrives to tell Jairus that his daughter has died. Imagine the devastation you'd feel. Jairus had felt there was hope. Jesus was coming to his house. Maybe he would heal his daughter. And now his daughter has died, and it seems it's too late. But Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe. And he continues on his way to Jairus' house, probably with an emotionally exhausted Jairus next to him. They arrived to the traditional sound of mourning, people crying and wailing to announce the passing of this young girl. Although these mourners would have been very unlikely to have included close relatives of Jairus' daughter. Jesus disperses the mourners to a degree of ridicule after he tells them that the girl is not dead but asleep, and continues into the house. It's just a small group, 3 of his disciples and the girl's parents. And there, he heals the girl. He takes her hand and he asks her to get up, and she does. Again, Jesus has ignored an accepted social rule here. Just as he would have been considered unclean to have interacted with the bleeding woman, it was also considered to be unclean to touch a dead body. Jesus just took the hand of the dead girl. There's less of a crowd to witness this, but it's another example of Jesus breaking through social boundaries to demonstrate there's room for everyone when it comes to asking for help from Jesus. And these are stories of great miracles and are cause for celebration of what Jesus can do and the healing that he can bring. But the nagging feeling I had when I was thinking about this talk was not so much why were these people healed, but why not others? Why not everyone? Why is it that when we come to Jesus and ask him to heal us, or a family member or a friend, it doesn't always happen? I'm sure there are many of us here who've asked or continue to ask Jesus to bring healing, but we feel like our prayers haven't been answered. Perhaps people we love have become ill and haven't got better. Perhaps we've been stuck in a horrible situation and we're still in it. Or perhaps we've prayed so hard and for so long about something that just hasn't changed. I don't have an answer to those questions. But what I think is that when we have faith in Jesus and we trust in God's goodness, God walks with us. Sometimes that might mean physical healing, which is wonderful. But sometimes healing might not look as we think it should, or as we desperately hope it will. What that doesn't mean is that Jesus isn't there with us. Having faith in Jesus will make a difference in our lives, even if it doesn't look the way we think it should. A few years ago, I moved to Bath, having been living in the northeast, and I moved there not knowing anyone, and I'd got a new job. But one of the reasons that I'd moved there, as with a few of my moves in my life, is because there was a really good hockey club there. And they basically played hockey in the absolute top league that we have in our country. And I had an opportunity to play for them. And I knew that this would be my chance to play at the highest possible level. And I knew that I could do it. I had the ability to do it. So I joined this club and I trained and I got selected and it was amazing. And I started to play. And about 3 weeks into the season, I ruptured my hamstring, which essentially means I pulled it away from the bone that it's supposed to be attached to. Not playing hockey, obviously playing a game with some friends. But it was really hard because I really wanted that dream to come true. And it was right there, right in front of me, and I was doing it. And then absolutely all of it got taken away. And not only that, but because I'd spent all my time so far in Bath playing hockey, I didn't know anyone. So I had a long period of time where I was really lonely and kind of questioning why it had happened, but also really praying for healing. In the end, the injury meant that I couldn't drive. I wasn't allowed to sit down. I could stand or I could lie on my front. Those are my options. So after a while, my employer at my school decided I was too exhausted to keep working because essentially I couldn't ever sit down during the day. I had to walk to the train station, stand on the train, walk at the other end, get to work, stand up all day, do the same on the way back, and they signed me off work. So I then had a period of time where I was just at home on my own. And it was really hard to work out how I was going to move through it. I spent loads of money on physios and consultants, and nobody could help. And in the end, I just had to accept that that was the situation as it was. I asked for physical healing for my hamstring, but actually what happened was God walked with me, and actually he showed me so much about myself in that time and changed my perspective entirely on my hockey, on my sport, on what I thought was the biggest priority in my life, and made me realise there was so much other stuff that I could be doing with my weekends, so many other people I could get to know that I wouldn't have otherwise known. And it took 2 years for me to be able to run again. But in that time, I learnt so much about God, and I learnt so much about the other parts of my life, that actually I was healed in a totally different way to the way that I thought I needed to be. So when we ask Jesus for healing in faith, our healing may not look the way we think it should, or even hope that it could be. But when we have faith, God meets us, and his presence alone, in whatever situation we're going through, will make a difference. So the challenge is to think of those situations in our lives that we're finding hard, or where we need healing, and to ask God to help us through them, even if the outcome may not be the one we think we need or feel that we deserve. To me, though, the biggest encouragement in this passage is this: Jesus sees everyone. We see this time and again throughout the Bible. Jesus sees Zacchaeus, the disliked tax collector in Jericho. He sees the little children that his disciples try to steer away from him. He sees the one person amongst many in the parable of the lost sheep. He sees the blind beggar when the crowd rebuked him and told him not to bother Jesus. And even when he was dying, he saw the criminal on the cross next to him. And in this passage, he sees Jairus and the woman, and he sees us. So if we're striving to live our lives as a reflection of Jesus, then surely we too should lift our eyes and really see people, regardless of who they are, whether we know them or not, or their place in society. Caitlin's been learning songs from The Greatest Showman at school over the last couple of weeks. And it actually made me think that the premise for that film and PJ Barham's circus is all based on seeing people who society dictates should live in the shadows. When they're seen for their talents rather than their unusual physical features, and they're given value, they're free to be themselves and live their lives with pride and confidence. God sees us, all of us. He sees our faith, even when it feels like all we can do is timidly reach out and touch the hem of his cloak. And he also sees our faith when we're bold and we call to him in our loudest voice. And God can heal, and he does heal, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Perhaps there are some of us here this morning who need to be reminded that we're seen by Jesus, regardless of our circumstances. Perhaps there are others of us who need to know that while God does heal, it might not look the way we expect it to. And perhaps there are many of us who can do more to really see the people we come across in our daily lives, so they may see Jesus through us. So how can we apply this to our lives? Perhaps we can aim to see people as Jesus does, especially those who are rejected and ignored by society. We should continue to pray for healing, even when the answers to those prayers may not feel the way we want them to. But most of all, we should be encouraged. Jesus sees us, and he knows us, and he stands with us in our struggles, and he does heal, sometimes in ways that we least expect.